All right, and then we'll begin the webinar. We'll give it a minute or two to give folks a chance to join us. All right. Good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Jessica from Greenlight and we are thrilled to host tonight's event with Christopher Cox presenting his new book, The Deadline Effect, How to Work Like It's the Last Minute Before the Last Minute. He'll be talking with Krishna Andavolu, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Christopher, to Krishna, and to the team at Avid Reader Press for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces right now, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. Now, a couple little housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see and hear you. They can see that you're here, and there are a couple different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first one is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like a speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. It's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and interact with fellow attendees. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that question in the Q&A. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program. And most importantly, tonight's featured book, The Deadline Effect, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person in our bookstore locations 12 p.m. to 7 p.m. every day of the week, and you can purchase Christopher's book and many others on site, or order online at greenlightbookstore.com for quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. I'll drop that buy link in the chat in a moment. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Okay, some introductions. Our interviewer tonight is Krishna Andavolu. Krishna is the anchor of Emmy Award-winning television news magazine VICE News Tonight and a correspondent for VICE on Showtime. He's also the host and executive producer of VICE's groundbreaking docuseries Weedakit on VICE TV and Hulu. He's going to be speaking tonight with our featured author, Christopher Cox. He's written about politics, business, books, and science for the New York Times Magazine, GQ, and many other publications. He was formerly the chief editor at Harper's Magazine, executive editor at GQ, where he worked on stories that won the Pulitzer Prize, the Penn Literary Award for Journalism, and multiple national magazine awards. His new book, The Deadline Effect, How to Work Like It's the Last Minute Before the Last Minute, is a wise and counterintuitive book that explores the power of deadlines as uniquely effective tools of motivation and empowerment. So Chris is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then he's going to be talking with Krishna and with all of you. Christopher, please take it away.
All right, thank you, Jessica. I think I'll start by saying thank you to Greenlight. Greenlight is my local bookstore, the closest bookstore to my house, and it's a wonderful place. And if anyone has not bought my book yet, you should buy it from there, and you can do it by clicking on the link in the chat. I'll put in a quick plug since Greenlight is listening to me right now, encouraging them to expand their hours. They should open up earlier in the morning. I always go there at like 10:30 and they're not open yet. So that's my request to Greenlight. All right, so I'll read from a short section of the book. Where do I have that? Oh, yes. So this is from the introduction, and it's sort of a self-contained story of someone who had a little bit of trouble with a deadline. The book is sort of composed that way. It's made out of case studies, both from history and ones that I went and observed myself. So this one is a historical case study, and unfortunately features some French names, which I'm definitely going to mangle, but I'll do my best. Okay. Recently, I came across the story of Évariste Galois, a 19th century mathematician whose short, doomed life provides an extreme example of a deadline at work. From an early age, Galois was known to be brilliant. His innovations in group theory, a branch of algebra that Henri Poincaré described as, quote, the whole of mathematics reduced to its pure form, have kept mathematicians busy for almost 200 years. The only problem was that, until the fateful intervention of a deadline, Galois couldn't get his ideas down on paper. He was born in 1811 in a suburb of Paris. His father was the mayor of the small town where he grew up, His mother was responsible for his early education and evidently taught him well. It was in school that his trouble started. He was impatient with those who couldn't keep up with him intellectually. The Argentine writer Cesar Aira, who wrote about Galois in his novel Birthday, said that in mathematics in particular, quote, the young genius had acquired the habit of executing all the intermediate steps in his head and thus arriving abruptly at the results. During an admissions exam for the École Polytechnique, which had the most prestigious mathematics program in France, he threw an eraser in the examiner's face. He was forced to enroll at the inferior École Normale, where, almost entirely on his own, he began breaking new ground in the theory of polynomial equations. Quote, I have carried out researches which will halt many savants in theirs, Galois bragged. When he tried to submit his work for publication, though, reviewers rejected it as incomplete. He had everything straight in his head, but he couldn't make other people see it. One paper he submitted to the Académie des Sciences was judged simply, quote, incomprehensible. We have made every effort to understand Mr. Galois' proofs. His argument is neither sufficiently clear nor sufficiently developed to allow us to judge its rigor. While Galois was at the École Normale, he became active in revolutionary politics. In July 1830, Parisians took to the streets to demand an end to the rule of the Bourbon dynasty, or Bourbon dynasty, and King Charles X. Over 3 glorious days, they stormed the Tuileries Palace and the Louvre and eventually forced the king into exile. At the end of the year, Galois published a letter excoriating the director of the École Normale for not letting students join the protest. The school expelled him. He spent the following year investing in radical causes in Paris. Quote, if a carcass is needed to stir up the people, I will donate mine, he said. He joined the artillery of the National Guard, which was openly defiant of the new French king, Louis Philippe. He spent time in prison for his Republican activities, including a stint for supposedly threatening the king's life. At a banquet attended by Alexandre Dumas, among others, he had toasted Louis Philippe while holding a dagger in his hand. None of this left much time for mathematics. Working on his own, he began slowly revising the paper he had submitted to the Académie des Sciences to make it more accessible to the judges. He was really just a willful kid, and he thought he had all the time in the world to be a mathematician. The end to this drama came in 1832, 1 month after Galois was released from prison. On May 25th, he wrote to his friend Auguste Chevalier that he was feeling distraught, that he doesn't spell out the cause. Quote, how can I console myself when in 1 month I've exhausted the greatest source of happiness a man can ever have? 4 days later, he told Chevalier that he had been provoked into a duel, which historians have ascribed either to a political disagreement or to a fight over a woman, or both. In the hours before he went to meet his rival, he stayed up late into the night writing letters. He wrote short notes to his Republican friends telling them goodbye, for he was sure he was going to die. Please remember me, since fate did not give me enough of a life to be remembered by my country, he wrote. But he spent most of the evening feverishly writing a long letter to Chevalier. My dear friend, he began, I have made some new discoveries and analysis. What followed was page after page of all the theoretical leads Galois had developed during his lifetime, but neglected to follow, a last will and testament for the mathematical mind that would die with him. He annotated the papers he had submitted to the Academy. He read out new proofs and corrected others. Everything in these papers, he told Chevalier, had been clear in his head for over a year. His writing grew frantic as the clock ticked down. In the margin of one page, he wrote, there are a few things left to be completed in this proof, but I have not the time. He closed his letter to Chevalier with a request to send his work to 2 of the leading mathematicians in France, so they could attest to the importance of what he had discovered. Quote, later there will be, I hope, some people who will find it to their advantage to decipher this mess. The duel was fought at 25 paces with pistols. Galois was shot in the stomach and collapsed. His seconds either abandoned him or went looking for help. In any case, a passing farmer discovered him and brought him to a nearby hospital. His brother Alfred was the only family member to make it to his bedside in time. Don't cry, Galois told him. I need all of my courage to die at age 20. He was buried in an unmarked grave. Galois theories took decades to be properly deciphered and understood, but they now form an indispensable part of our understanding of mathematics. In 1951, the theoretical physicist Hermann Weyl marveled at the near-miss quality of all of this, and the good fortune that Galois managed to get a final message to his friend. Quote, "This letter, if judged by the novelty and profundity of ideas it contains, is perhaps the most substantial piece of writing in the whole literature of mankind." For poor Galois, though, wouldn't it have been better if he'd found a different source of motivation than imminent death? All right, so that's my excerpt.
And I'm gonna unmute myself. You can hear me, right, Chris?
Hi, Krishna. Yeah, I can hear you.
Hey, how's it going? Thank you for having me on to discuss this with you, because it gave me a real deadline to read your book. And I'll be honest, even though you asked me to do this like maybe a couple months ago, I read it like in the last couple of days. So I think the deadline effect, so to speak, that maybe Galois kind of dealt with too, maybe hit me also. But I want to ask you, because like I think we all have some version of this circumstance where there's a deadline to do something. We kind of have the intention to do it beforehand. Turns out crunch time comes, then we get it done and we're super happy with it. And we're like, hey, maybe it's the deadline that actually made me do the best work. What is the deadline effect, I guess, as it's kind of more broadly understood, and how do you kind of reclaim it, right, play with it, make it like a plastic thing to play around with?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Like, definitely everyone knows that deadlines can be motivating, and the reason we all end up doing things like all-nighters to finish projects is that we like to procrastinate, but then when the deadline actually rolls around, it does motivate us to get that work done. And so that's the sort of traditional definition of the deadline effect. It's the tendency to put things off to the last minute, and also the ability of that last minute pressure to urge us to actually get things done, to be productive. And so the book is sort of saying, okay, fine, like let's harness the power of the deadline, the urgency of a deadline, but get rid of all the stuff that has to do with procrastination and getting it, waiting to the last minute, running out of time, doing shoddy work because you don't have enough time. And so, over the course of 7 chapters and a bunch of case studies, I sort of look at different ways to solve that problem, to sort of take the urgency, but deploy it in a more steady and rational way.
So let's talk about those case studies, because something that I found so enjoyable about the book was that, yes, there is a lot of engagement with the behavioral psychology, the behavioral economics, the literature and the management studies that have gone on through the ages about this kind of very topic. But what's fun is that you're with a whole bunch of different businesses and creative entities and otherwise who are, hitting a deadline and have different ways of doing it. You learn a lot, and it kind of builds upon each other through each case study. So maybe just give us a roadmap, like where did you go, who did you meet, and why?
Sure, yeah. That's exactly right. I sort of wanted to, write about psychology and the way that our brains work, but I also wanted to see the stuff sort of how it played out on the ground. And so over the course of 7 chapters, I ended up talking about 9 different organizations. And each one has a different thing to offer, I think, the reader in terms of understanding, how to be creative, how to be productive, and how to succeed on a deadline. So just to run through them really quickly, the first chapter is mainly about this the sort of restaurant empire of Jean-Georges von Gerichten, who's a fine dining chef.
Which I might add that, like, don't start reading this book in the early or late afternoon, because the first chapter makes you very hungry and you end up eating a lot, like a big dinner. Anyway, continue.
That's very good advice. Although if you do end up reading and getting hungry, Jean-Georges has like 42 restaurants, so you could probably find one not too far from you.
Which is sort of the point, right? He's got it down to a science, how to do this thing where you start a restaurant.
Yeah. He's got an empire, and that's what that chapter looks at, is how did he build that empire? And of course, if you have 42 restaurants, you have to open 42 restaurants. And so he's specifically good at opening restaurants. So he's good at sort of working down to that deadline of this is opening day, and I want everything to be as perfect as possible in this restaurant on that day.
And these are high standards. We're talking about like Michelin stars, like the highest of culinary standards, the highest of standards as you can think of, really.
Yes, yeah. And Jean Georges himself has 2 Michelin stars at his flagship restaurant.
Used to have 3. Used to have 3.
He did. Yeah, I talk about that in the book a little bit too. It's just how like how unusual it is for someone to sort of marry that highest level of achievement, that 3 Michelin star level of achievement in the culinary world, with having 42 restaurants. Like he's the only one who does anything close to that. And I mean, I don't quite explicitly say this in the book, but I think the judges are not just delivering a ruling on his one restaurant when they give him 2 Michelin stars instead of 3. They're also sort of saying like, maybe you shouldn't be doing all this like empire building. Maybe you should focus on your one main restaurant. But anyway, it's too late for him, and he has too much fun opening restaurants and traveling all over the world. After reporting with him for several weeks, I now follow like every single Jean Georges Instagram account, and it's really good for FOMO. It's like he's always in like the Côte d'Azur or whatever, and then jetting to Singapore and then coming back to New York. But anyway, yeah, so Jean Georges, I was there when he opened 2 restaurants back-to-back days, and saw how he did it. And, you know, the most important thing that he did was basically set up interim deadlines on the way to opening day, where he basically just did a dry run of the restaurant as it would be operating once it was finally opened, day after day after day. And of course, you can't, I mean, the dry run, who comes to dry run? He invites staff from his business and the staff from the developer of the restaurant. He like invites people who aren't actual customers to go through what's called a mock service, but he just does it day after day for 2 months or more before the opening of the restaurant. And, you know, that is what helps him open on time and open in a way that, you know, most restaurants don't look on opening day. Like there are no hiccups on opening day.
Mm-hmm.
So I was going to go through all the chapters, but maybe we should just talk about them one at a time.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. Sure. Well, okay, so I'm familiar with the concept of a soft launch, and I think the next chapter sort of thinks about that in other ways as well. But like, you know, I make television and documentary. I do a nightly news show where the deadline is like very clear, and we have like sort of hour by hour necessities. The systems are built, and we built them because there's no plan B. I mean, there is a plan B, but we have to meet these deadlines. Specifically, you're giving an air date, you make a calendar going backwards. This needs to be done in this much time. You have a general sense of how long it's going to take. One thing you do tangle with is like this concept of the planning fallacy, which is to say like you never really allot enough time to get the things done that you want to get done. But with the Jean Georges chapter, what I found so interesting is that not only was it a deadline that he instituted himself, but then there was one that was kind of foisted upon him. So those are like 2 competing things, right? Like if I'm working on something, I might be like, oh, I want to get that done by X amount of time. But then maybe someone else tells me you got to get it done by this other time. And there's a convergence at that point. So like, what was it? How did the convergence at all change this formula that he and his team had to open these restaurants?
I mean, I think actually for Jean Georges, the 2 restaurants had different opening experiences. One was a success and one was, if not a failure, was less of a success, let's say. And I don't actually think that it was the way the deadline was imposed that changed it. So yes, the one that was a success, Jean Georges chose that date, and the other one was imposed by the developer of the hotel where the restaurant was. But the main thing that changed the outcome was just the developer didn't let Jean Georges into the restaurant. So he couldn't do this like iterative practicing thing that he does with mock services. So he couldn't do mock services, and he just had to rush in 2 days before and get everything sort of pulled together. So basically, someone else forced Jean Georges to abandon his own system, and the results were not as good. I mean, he's a master at opening restaurants, and someone screwed with that system. And so, yeah, I think if when he's allowed to work the way he wants to, he's a genius at opening. But yeah, I talk a little bit about the difference between self-imposed deadlines in general and mandatory deadlines, and talking about some of the social science that I've read, like reading through all these papers, like there's a big debate whether self-imposed deadlines are even effective. And I think the consensus is that they are. Like if basically the worst deadline that you can set for yourself is something that's not concrete. So just like the worst deadline is as soon as possible, because it's so open-ended that it sounds urgent, but you actually don't work with the urgency that you would if you had an actual deadline. So as long as you set a concrete deadline for yourself, it's going to be effective or have an effect. Now, if you can set a concrete deadline and then built-in added enforcement to that deadline, then it's all the better. Like the more sort of like, I'm just thinking about like VICE and what you do, like the more people you have looking over your shoulder or demanding that you stay on schedule, or the more people you're going to disappoint if you don't stay on schedule, the more likely it is you will. And so whether you're doing independent projects or working within a larger team, like take that wisdom and run with it. So if you're all by yourself, figure out who you can bring into the process to help keep you on target.
So that's a meta theme that I think like runs throughout the book. And we talked about this earlier, and maybe I'm jumping ahead, but I want to say it now because it's coming up. And I can't tell if this is like a subtle thing that kind of comes out through the book or is actually quite obvious, which is when we make things and we set a deadline, we're making things for other people, right? Like you wrote a book, people are going to read it. Like I make a TV show, people watch it. Our interaction with our audience is part of the making. When we bring our audience in as much as we can to the making of something, and as early as we can to the making of something, the more likely that we will hit whatever deadline that we're looking at with the quality that we were hoping for, which is to say, don't keep it bottled up like maybe a Galois did until the last minute, because once it hits the public, you don't have the time to reassess what might be working, what might not be working, and the pressure of actually getting it done when you need to get it done might not be there. So I think that's something that I found really intriguing and something I maybe hadn't really thought of in that way. And so that actually brings me to a zoomer outer question of like, why did you write this book? Because part of me looks at the book and I think, oh, this could be like assigned to like people in business school in like a management course, or this is like the kind of thing I can like read at the beach and like have a pretty good time because it's those lively sort of sections with, and we'll talk about this later, selling TVs at Best Buy, so like there's a lot in there. So the question, like, if audience matters in that way, in conceiving of writing this book, like what were you thinking as far as audience? Who are you writing this for and why?
Well, I mean, I only I know my own experience the best. And so the thing that got me on this like topic first was just working as an editor at magazines, where you have to be somewhat obsessed with deadlines, and then starting to notice what worked and what didn't to motivate people to get things done. And, it's a creative endeavor. So there's some thinking out there that basically you can't rush creativity, or that like artistic works thrive best in wide open space. But I mostly found that's not true. Like by imposing a deadline on an artist, all you end up really doing is eliminating the time that he or she has to procrastinate, and procrastination is painful, right? So you're actually helping them out. Like the sooner you get into that creative mode, the happier you'll be. And so that got me on the topic. And then, in terms of who I think is reading this book or should read this book, I'll say that like I immediately knew when I started getting into it that I didn't just want to talk about I didn't just want to like repeat a bunch of scientific papers about the psychology of deadlines. I wanted to see how it worked in the real world. So that's why it's structured as a series of case studies, because there's only so much I think you can learn from experiments done on college students, which is what most of these social science papers are. And so I was very happy to get out there in the world and watch how people were sort of taking these things I'd read about in the scientific literature, but sort of putting them into effect.
Yeah, so let's hop then back into the world of case study. I'm really tempted to get into the Best Buy stuff, but let's go.
I should have my Best Buy shirt. Wait, actually, hold on. Is this
Get
weird?
it? Yeah,
Is
if you
it weird
have
to
it.
leave a live Zoom? I'm gonna do it.
No, not for a prop. Just to fill everyone in, there is a chapter where Chris, unbeknownst to Best Buy, gets a job at a Best Buy as they're gearing up for Black Friday and sees what they do for that like once in a year event. Did you find it? No.
No, yeah. I'm not going to put on my polo because that would be too weird to take off my shirt. But I have my original Best Buy name tag here, which I can.
Oh, that's so good.
Yeah, it says that I'm what does it say? An Apple master and a team member since 2018, which is false. So
okay, so the Best Buy case is also unique. I suppose they're all unique, but Best Buy obviously runs 364 days a year, but there's a very special day called Black Friday, and they change things up. So to me, that chapter was about like, things might be working for some things, but sometimes you got to change them to meet a different kind of deadline. So talk to me about that. I mean, it's also, I thought, very interesting because you see it from not a management perspective, but from a labor perspective, how a large organization faced with a deadline retools and reimagines what they do for that particular purpose. So what was it like?
Yeah, I was definitely part of the labor force for that. I got a job there, and I basically got hired in October and worked through Black Friday, and then resigned immediately afterward. It was so hard. It was like the actual physical labor of working there was so draining. But I did learn a lot. And so, I mean, basically, the Best Buy chapter is the second to last chapter. All the chapters before that, I would say, could be applied to any project, no matter how big or how small. The Best Buy chapter is the first one that sort of takes on the question of, okay, what do you do if you have something that you need to accomplish? It's so huge you can barely wrap your head around it, and that's sort of that's the problem Best Buy has on Black Friday. It's like on a normal day, or on Black Friday, they get 10 times or more, maybe 20 times, depending on the store, the number of people that they have on a normal day. Like you can't just, work a little bit harder and handle that kind of influx. So I looked at what they did to the store to prepare for that total change in the way they did business, and they responded to it commensurately. Everything changes in that store. They get rid of employee commissions so the employees are more efficient at like handing off customers. They break the store into zones. They create multiple checkout lines. They route people outside the store to get special big ticket items. It's inspiring in a way at how a retail operation like that can just totally remake themselves on the fly, once a year, and it still works. And Best Buy has an unusually good track record for not having people die on their stores on Black Friday, which is, that's really the goal, right? Fewer deaths.
Well, people want TVs.
Yeah,
for sure.
So that was inspiring, and I talk about, some lessons that you can draw from that for deadlines, and it comes back actually what you're saying about bringing people into the process. In management studies, there's this notion of interdependence. Like there's 3 types of interdependence, the more interdependent an organization is, the better it tends to be at meeting deadlines. And so Best Buy went from the least interdependent organization, where basically every employee was out for him or herself trying to get sales, to on Black Friday being incredibly interdependent, where each employee could only complete a sale if they partnered with several other employees to get that person like processed through the system. And they only do that for those 2 days, but that's how they're able to handle the huge influx of customers on those days.
Right, and that's sort of like a quantity over quality situation, because they kind of get rid of some of their other metrics, which is like you want to upsell people or, get them a credit card or whatever, other sorts of things. The idea is just like get people through the door.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they still push credit cards, but yeah, get rid of some of the other things that are niceties on a day when you're just going to be completely overwhelmed.
So that, I mean, that's sort of like, it gets back to audience being part of the creative process. But maybe selling TVs isn't a creative process, but making a play is, right? And you're at the Public Theater for one of the chapters that precedes the Best Buy chapter.
Yeah.
And so, I think we're all kind of familiar with previews and with, the way that maybe a play that is written is put on. But what did you observe, like sitting in the house watching, a new play come together, knowing there's an obvious deadline of opening night, right? That's kind of like very obvious, and having audience input. But then I guess the word that comes up is like checking in or something like that.
Well, there's sense making and updating. Yeah, like that. Another thing I read in like the scientific papers that I saw play out in the real world. I mean, I guess I had a sense from acting in high school plays and not much beyond that, that like, there's a script and you rehearse and then there's opening night and then that's it. But in the Public Theater, I saw a much more sort of a process that was much more responsive to both like the actors and the people who are putting on the play, but then also ultimately the audience. And so I embedded with a production, and it was sort of a world premiere of a new play. And it was just interesting to see how often the play itself would change, or, the blocking, the acting, the cues, everything that was happening all the way through past opening night. I mean, so, there's opening night, there's dress rehearsal, but then there's also an extended period of previews in professional productions like this. And during previews, where you have paying customers coming in to like watch the play, the whole performance can change dramatically. And in the show that I saw, those changes were more subtle. I mean, you have to sort of have been part of the process to see them. But I talked to the director of who was working at the Public while I was there, and he brought up Hello, Dolly, which I think is still, or at the time at least, was like one of the highest earning musicals of all time. And they wrote whole new like show-stopping numbers after previews for that musical. And it was kind of a flop in previews, but then it became beloved after they basically responded to what the audience was feedback the audience was giving them, and updated the play accordingly. So getting back to the whole idea of the deadline effect and why would you want to like not work at the last minute? I mean, that's the reason, is like, you have a chance to revise, you have a chance to update what you're doing and make it better. You can turn Hello, Dolly from a flop into a complete hit based if you just built into the process moments to do that. So the way they built that in the theater is creating the preview process, where it's called previews. So, everyone knows that the show isn't actually locked. And then they use those weeks and those shows to help them make a better performance.
And so that feeds from externalities to some degree, right? Which is like, there's going to be outside people that are going to watch this. So we need to bring outside people into it to develop it by the time we consider it done, or whatever that deadline is. It's an extended deadline process. And of course, it's a play. There's many people involved. I wondered, like, for those, like, I have my job. I have creative processes I try to do on my own. I can never really get any of that stuff done, like my own personal writing or personal ideas, because I'll set a deadline for myself, like, oh, let me get that part of it done by, Friday. But then it's, there's Friday happens. Yeah. I suppose, like, I'm asking maybe something that's outside of the book itself, but like in the learnings through it and how systems work, did you find a way to translate the systems to like an individual's practice? I suppose this actually might even be a very specific question to you, is like, you had a deadline for this book, your manuscript, I imagine. So were you able to apply some of the lessons learned in the field reporting and in the literature study to the actual work itself?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the epilogue of the book is sort of all about how I use what I learned to make sure that I wrote the book on time. And I did turn it in on the date that I said I would to my editor. But I feel like for you, let's take on your problem. If you're doing the first thing right, you're setting a deadline. If you're setting a deadline on Friday to get this, personal project done, then you've made some progress that some people don't make. If that's not working for you, then I would try, setting an interim deadline like John George. So instead of saying I want to have this done by Friday, say like, let's say it's a writing project. I want to have one paragraph written by Monday, So like set little benchmarks along the way. And then there's another chapter that I talks about Telluride Ski Resort. And the lesson there was this idea of setting a soft deadline with teeth. So you might need to like set some deadlines with teeth, basically. It's like, okay, if I don't turn this in by Friday, something will happen. Or a milder version of that's not punitive could be just like, oh, I'm gonna like on Wednesday before the Friday that I want to have this done, I'm gonna like give it to my wife to read. And if I don't have that, then she'll be disappointed. Like that's a very mild version of giving teeth to something, but it actually ends up being, motivating. And so the more of those kind of things you build in, all you're trying to do is take your mind out of this mode where you're just sort of like not making progress, like where you're sort of either procrastinating or you're allowing other things to have higher priority, and keep returning to the project that you want to work on. And I think little by little you'll find that these things add up and make a difference.
And again, I really do. It really strikes me that like I have this tendency to want to keep something with me until I feel like it's ready to show.
Yeah.
And I want to keep working on it until it comes to this point where I believe it's ready to show to people. But you have to kind of get past that and just show it, like give yourself a deadline where you're going to show it to people. That's before the deadline of like, hey, I want this to be finished, so that you can have the time to finish it.
Yeah.
And there's like some boldness involved with that, or some, getting over self-consciousness or things like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a shift in your psychology. I mean, basically, if you can tell yourself and then tell whoever it is you're sort of letting see your work before it's really done, if you can just reassure everyone like, oh, this is a draft, this is like not finished, then I think that's both freeing for the creative process. Like if you sort of lower the stakes, then you might actually sort of find getting down to work more easy. But then, it also prevents anyone from getting their feelings hurt if something's not perfect, like at Telluride. So what they do is they really have to be open for the week before New Year's Eve, because that's when most of the revenue comes in. And the resort has to be pretty perfect by then if they're not going to disappoint all of their customers. So in order to make that happen, they open on Thanksgiving. So like not that many people ski on Thanksgiving, but it's sort of like a soft open, but there's teeth to it because there are going to be real people that come. The smaller crowd that comes on Thanksgiving is really going to be there and really be, skiing that mountain. But everyone from the resort itself to the people that come there know that it's not going to be, a perfect resort on Thanksgiving. There's not enough time for it to snow enough for it to be a perfect resort on that day. But by sort of being willing to sort of open the resort in a less than perfect state, less than finished state on Thanksgiving, they're ensuring that it is perfect or as close to perfect as possible on Christmas and New Year's. So that works for them.
The teeth is there because it's actual paying customers, but it's not the make or break, which is the week after Christmas.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if they fail at Thanksgiving, the stakes are much lower, and they still have a chance to succeed by Christmas.
You know what? It's just striking me that you have written a book where you spent time with one of the best chefs on the planet, and then you went and skied at like a really nice place to go skiing. And then you saw a play being formed. I suppose like maybe Best Buy was a little bit less than a vacation, but pretty good choices.
Yeah, there is the Best Buy discount, so I could have gotten myself a flat screen and really made it pay. Although for ethical reasons, I decided not to do that.
Yeah, and I should actually remind everyone watching that there is a Q&A document that you can put in questions, and I think we have some time reserved towards the end to get those questions from our kind attendees. But I am having fun talking to you, Chris, so continue, please.
Yeah. No, it's funny, like, once a magazine editor, always a magazine editor. I joke that to write this book, I basically created a special issue of a magazine and then assigned every piece to myself. And I mean, there's no coincidence that a lot of those pieces were fun to report, skiing, restaurants, even going out. I went out to like an Easter lily farm on the West Coast, and that was fun because it's beautiful out there, and Easter lily is like an unusual crop, and just learning about how that was put together was, I would say, the least fun chapter was not Best Buy. It was probably being on the campaign trail, which is a little bit of a slog. There was a chapter when I followed a presidential candidate around, and it was.
Tell me about that one, because I think that's the one.
Yeah.
Say again.
It was fascinating, but it was not super fun.
Because it's stressful, right? And people aren't generally happy on political campaign.
Angry people come to political meetings, and you get to talk to them. But.
What were the deadlines there other than election day?
Well, so like, I followed this guy named John Delaney, who was running for the Democratic presidential nomination, and he was a long shot candidate. And I'm here to tell you, he did not become the president of the United States. So it didn't work out for him.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah, sorry. I say it in the book though, so it's okay. So the thing that he did that was smart was he set a deadline for himself that was much more concrete than just like become president. The DNC, the Democratic primary, was run in such a way that there was a debate in June of 2020, so of 2019, well before the primaries. And so that was his goal. I need to get on that debate stage no matter what. And then I watched how he sort of reconfigured his campaign to achieve that one goal. And it was a modest goal. Like there were 20, I can't remember how many people, there were dozens of candidates who got to be in the debate. And so he set a modest goal that he could achieve, and did achieve it. He was on the stage and lasted as a candidate beyond that.
Sorry if my attention was waning. I was looking at the questions and answers.
Questions, yeah.
There are no answers yet, but they're the questions. And I think we should maybe move into that phase.
Sure.
I'm going to start with the first couple questions. And I think it's interesting, which is like, since the publication, have you received any feedback from the entities that you had embedded with, either positive or negative, about their secrets? I mean, in some ways, you're kind of, they're trade secrets here to some degree.
Yeah, sure. I've talked to everyone, and except for Best Buy. Since then, Best Buy, I think they are happy that I thought that they did things that were successful, but they've definitely not talked to me directly since I quit my job on the day after Black Friday. But yeah, like I'll tell you who was happiest about that. Like the Air Force is the last chapter I write. And this is a particular unit of the Air Force that it specializes in disaster relief. So their job is to go out whenever there's an earthquake or a hurricane and help organize relief flights after those disasters. And after the book came out, I heard from several of those airmen who, had sort of didn't know what was going to happen after the strange guy showed up and started taking notes about what they were doing. But we're very happy to see their work in print. So that was gratifying.
Well, the mention of the U.S. military does well to segue into Matt Fraser's question, a question I had myself, but sort of avoided because I've been living this news for the past few weeks about the deadline in Afghanistan. Now, of course, I would caution against, armchair quarterbacking something like that in an event like this. However, the question is, the most recent above the fold example of a deadline met was the U.S. military's withdrawal from Afghanistan. What lessons could the Biden administration have learned from your research about how to meet a deadline well? You must
Well,
have been thinking about that to some degree, right? Like,
yeah, of course. No, I mean, the word deadline has been in the news a lot recently because, you know, of yesterday's deadline to withdraw from the country. I guess I'll say first that the fact that the administration has now flown out 115,000 people in like 20 days did not surprise me. Having reported that Air Force chapter and just seeing how efficient these operations are with these giant planes at moving things around, like the fact that the military was able to do that accorded perfectly well with what I saw on the ground with the Air Force. And then in terms of that deadline, I mean, I guess I will not be an armchair quarterback on the political side of it, but it was effective, right? I mean, like they got a lot done in a short amount of time because they decided to stick to that deadline. And I've seen that with other things with the Biden administration, especially the vaccine rollout. You know, they attach deadlines to all these different milestones, and especially the earliest one, which was 100 million, and then they upgraded to 200 million shots in the first 100 days. Like, they achieved that. And I think part of the reason they achieved that was because they were so concrete about that deadline and public.
Well, I might actually even piggyback on that and say part of the reason they achieved the secondary deadline of higher is then they floated the first deadline. A lot of the pushback was that's not aggressive enough. Like, you do the math on that, we're already on that trajectory, guy. Like, shouldn't we be doing better? And then whoop. So maybe that was planned. Maybe that was actually the sort of dialectic between the deadline maker and then the audience that they're serving. But that's intriguing, actually. I hadn't thought of it that way.
Yeah, no, they responded, I think, both to criticism and sort of observed at how quickly they were scaling things up. It also accords with something I talk about in the book, which is goal setting theory, which sounds very broad, but actually in this context just means, like, if you set yourself a goal that's both concrete, again, concreteness is always an important element of it, but also difficult, you're more likely to achieve it. And so when they upgraded that goal to 200 million doses, that made me happy. I thought, like, oh, that means they're more likely to get this done, actually, because it's both concrete and difficult.
I have a very fun question. I'm going to do another one that's also fun because I think we sort of talked about it a little bit, from Christina S. Lewis. The examples in the book are oftentimes about businesses, systems, organizations. Did you spend any time with an individual who never misses a deadline? What's their secret? Because I want to know that too.
Yeah. I mean, you know, that on the individual level, I think it comes down so much more to like individual psychology, especially if you're not using any of these like tricks, any of these ways to sort of embed yourself in a system. So my first answer to that is embed yourself in a system. Like, no matter who you are, whether you're good with deadlines or not, like, find a system for yourself and add enforcement to it and add people who are going to be involved in the process of whatever project you're working on. And then you don't have to worry about whether you're psychologically a chronic procrastinator or not, because you just have all these other forces pushing you in the direction of getting things done. In terms of individuals, I mean, the person I write about at the greatest length as an individual is this writer who is the opposite. He's like terrible at deadlines, and would blow past deadlines and keep going for months and months. Like, he had things that were still overdue from years ago, at both Harper's and at GQ. But by applying just a few like deadline tricks to working with him, he suddenly was able to turn things on time, and they were also just as good as the stuff he wrote when he had, you know, months and months to spare. So that was an eye-opening moment for me. Like, that was actually, again, like one of the origins of the book was seeing stuff like that play out.
Okay, I got a question from Mark Hatch Miller, and this is more about the literature review, which I think to give my comment there, like, the book is so nicely tied together. Like, the book is sort of like constructed of bricks of your field reporting, and then it's kind of mortared together with the like reading a bunch of stuff that frankly I will never read. And so I was like really nice and happy to see you do that review for us. But so Mark's question, is there any evidence from your literature review that strict adherence to deadlines stifles visionary creativity? So Mark's ripped from the headlines, counterexample question, could Kanye West benefit from deadlines? Thanks, Mark.
Yes, ripped from the headlines. Yeah, I mean, like, it's true what you say about the book. I appreciate that insight in terms of like the bricks and mortar analogy. I might have to start using that. I read a lot of papers published in publications like Administrative Quarterly Review.
Wow, that
yeah.
is quite the title.
And actually that had one of my favorite papers in it too. So you never know. Read papers like Procrastination and Pigeons. Like there's the field is vast.
Pigeons procrastinate.
They do, yeah. Rats procrastinate too.
Not on my blog. They are busy.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, they still get a lot done. God bless them. But no, like my personal experience and my experience in reading the scientific literature is ultimately creativity and timeliness are not at odds at all. Like, you know, there is a reason the phrase deadline poet exists. Like the trick of a deadline is to push you into like a creative mode and to push you into that like state of flow when you're really like working at your best. And that can happen sort of, it doesn't require empty space for that to happen. And in fact, I feel like empty space, empty time can be counterproductive. There's a study like that I read, it was published by some academics from Hebrew University, and their ultimate conclusion was, which I can quote, when the time for doing something, be it completion of a project or group decision-making, when that time is limited, people are less wasteful, more focused, productive, and creative. And that sort of that's the spirit of all these studies I read, was like, you know, to conceive of deadlines as a cudgel that you beat yourself over the head with is the wrong way to think of these things. Like deadlines are the things that push you into that expansive creative mode that is actually like, it's a good feeling. And then sort of, you know, going back to the bricks of the thing, like one thing I noticed in all these workplaces I went to was how happy everyone was. Like people there were like under extreme time pressure, but everyone seemed to like really like their jobs and were, you know, unified in this mission of getting these projects done. It made the whole book very fun to report because everyone was sort of like motivated and happy.
No, I think there's one more question. It's from Charles Cox. Any subjects or deadline examples that appeal to you that you might cover in Deadlines 2? Or, yeah, I guess Deadlines 2.
Deadlines 2, coming soon. That's my brother. Thanks, Charles. Yeah, I mean, there were things that I wanted to do for this round, but wasn't able to. After hearing from you, Krishna, I feel like daily TV show could be interesting. I've been working at the New York Times Magazine recently, and a weekly magazine is a really intense like pressure cooker, and there are interesting insights that I feel like I've gotten from that. I tried really hard to, so to back up one step, there was one of the inspirations for this book was this episode of This American Life where they go to a used car dealership and they have a deadline of the end of the month. They like have to meet all these like sales quotas. And I found that learning about that whole experience was fascinating. Like it really did motivate them. They achieved their goal by the end of the month. And I thought an equivalent version of that could be to go inside of like one of these New York real estate brokerages that are like boiler room kind of situations where they have to get a certain amount of inventory rented by the end of the month, and watching that. Because like, again, like with this book, like half of my interest is in how people get things done, how they remain productive. And the other half is just like learning about a new industry and how that industry works.
Take me behind the scenes a little bit, because I'm just curious journalistically, like what was your pitch to the folks that you tried to embed with? Like, how did you get the access, I guess is the question.
Yeah, I mean, my pitch was basically laying out the book project for them. And for a lot of them, it helped that I was writing a book rather than an article. Just because a book seems like it's somewhere way off in the distant future. And so I feel like they just relaxed a little bit more when I was around them, because it wasn't going to be in a magazine or on the front page of the newspaper or anything like that.
And you didn't bring a photographer, I imagine.
Yeah, no photographs. I mean, some people wanted photographs. The Air Force guys definitely wanted to be photographed. But, you know, each pitch was like a little bit different depending on who I was talking to. And I don't know, it was like the Easter lily people, the farmers in rural Oregon and California just had like no idea what I wanted or why I was there, but they're like, fine, come watch us like sort Easter lily bulbs. John George is super media savvy, and he was like, I'll do it, but you know, I want to make sure that we have a shot of being featured in the New York Times, which of course it was in the New York Times. So it sort of ran that whole gamut. And there were some people, like especially like the Telluride guy, who was super proud of their systems. They're proud of what they'd learned, and wanted to sort of talk about it. They wanted to share their wisdom. And so that also made access easier, because it's like, oh yeah, I have a message I want to share with the world.
I have an idea for deadlines too. Like Emerald Triangle, Northern California harvest season. Like, how do you get the weed off the plants and into the stores in time?
It was funny in Easter lily country. They were complaining about the weed business because they said all of the young farm workers want to work in harvesting marijuana rather than Easter lilies, even though the pay is the same, just because the crop is, you know, it's cooler. So they were mad.
Yes, I imagine if you know, the employee discount is probably a little danker too.
Exactly.
I think we might have run out of questions from the audience. If anyone else has anything to ask.
And time too. We have 3 minutes left.
We only have 3 minutes, but we should really use those 3 minutes, because now we have debuted, we've interacted with the audience, right? So we can not update.
Click the link in the chat. Oh, you're trying to run through the steps in the book?
Yeah, I'm trying to
updating and sense making. That's, yeah. So sense making is when you pause and you take stock of what's happened so far, and updating is when you change your behavior accordingly. So that's what Hello Dolly did. And in the book, I talk about doctors who do that. Like the most successful surgeons pause in the middle of their surgery and take stock of what's going on, what's going right, what's going wrong, and then update what they're doing. The worst surgeons are the ones who just plow ahead and kill you because they don't know what's going on.
You don't want surgeons plowing. And if I were to take stock at the moment, I would say that one thing we're doing definitely wrong is that we're not having drinks. And that's something I think that could probably be solved. And I'm not exactly, maybe you are, I don't know.
No, but it's a good idea. Should we do a separate Zoom after this? It's just everybody drinking.
That's great.
All right, all people in the chat are invited.
But yes, I would, you know, just I suppose I would say this is a really fun book to read. And I listened to it, I'll be honest, because you gave me a link to listen to it. And it just, you know, it gets your mind moving about yourself and about the world and systems. And I don't know, maybe it'll help me personally. Maybe not.
I could also be your personal life coach too, Krishna, if you need that.
I appreciate that, Chris. Thank you. I need a life coach, that's for sure.
Thanks, Christopher, for teaching us all a thing or two. It was so fun to be part of this conversation with you guys. We appreciate your time tonight. Just a reminder for everyone who's watching, the link to buy The Deadline Effect is there in the chat, and you can have it shipped to you, or you can pick it up at the store. You can also check out our YouTube channel, Greenlight Bookstore. We'll have a recording of this event up within the next couple of days, so you can share it with somebody else you think maybe needs a little bit of help with their deadlines. But thanks so much for your time tonight. Have a great evening, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.